In part two of this week's discussion on race and ethnicity from the Henslin text, that's chapter 9 in the Henslin text, we're going to look at kind of more of a global perspective about race and ethnicity. Although I have to tell you, that's probably a misnomer for this section, because really what we're looking at is the United States as it relates to different populations that have come from the globe, but from around the globe. But we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along. So when we look at the issue about global patterns of intergroup relations, this is how do societies deal with diversity. There are different types of methods, let's say, that societies employ in order to deal with differences within their population. And first, one method of dealing with diversity is for the majority population to dominate the minority groups. And there are different ways of doing this, and one of them is genocide. That is just the outright extermination of minority groups. And we've seen instances of that in Europe and in some parts, I believe, of Africa more recently. Where the dominant group has just put to death individuals in the minority group. Population transfer, another term for this would be expulsion, where entire groups are expelled from a population or from an area, so to speak, to make the area more ethnically pure. This is something that occurred within our own history with the Trail of Tears that we'll touch on in a little while, involving Native Americans in the 1800s. Internal colonialism, where the minority group is subjugated or enslaved in order to, in relation, let's say, to the majority group, so that they may be owned, as was the case during our slavery period. Their behavior is controlled and manipulated. This is another form of domination by the larger group. And finally, segregation, which involves not enslaving groups, but separating them from the larger group in order to have minimal interaction between the minority group and the majority group. And there are two different types of segregation. One is called de jure and the other de facto. De jure meaning by law, and the United States actually, until the 1950s, the rulings of the United States Supreme Court reinforced segregation as legally speaking within the United States. And then that changed with and a slide will tell you this in a few moments, but changed with a series of court decisions and legislative congressional actions and presidential proclamations and things through the 1950s and 1960s. But the actual behaviors in society changed much more slowly. So while segregation no longer existed by law, de jure that is, no longer existed by law, in fact segregation continued. That's what they call de facto segregation. It's against the law, but it still was occurring. So those are different ways that a society might dominate, majority groups within a society may dominate those in a minority group. Another way that a society might deal with diversity is known as assimilation, and this is where the minority group disappears into the majority culture totally. That there may be some change in the core culture because of this assimilation of the minority group, but really the minority group just goes away. It no longer exists, and it's assimilated into the majority culture. The quote in the Statue of Liberty, "Give me your tired and your poor, your wretched refuse, yearning to breathe free." This kind of represents the notion that America, well, we refer to it as a melting pot, and so everybody joins in and they become Americans, and we're all the same after that. If that were only the case, but that's sort of the theory of America. Finally, multiculturalism or pluralism is what it's referred to, where various ethnic groups coexist in respect and tolerance. It doesn't have to be ethnic groups, but various groups that might otherwise be minorities coexist in respect and tolerance and maintain their own unique traditions. Switzerland may be an example of a multicultural nation, although I've known young people who have grown up in Switzerland who tell me that indeed that's not the case, and particularly more recently, there have been some plebiscites, I guess, against Muslims and some of their religious practices and things like this. So perhaps it's not as multicultural as it once was. But Switzerland has 20 some different languages that have been able to maintain themselves, and yet this country still remains a connection between all of these groups. And so sometimes it's kind of held out as an example of multiculturalism, but it may not be a very good one. Um, I've heard the difference between the melting pot, the assimilation, America as a melting pot, and multiculturalism is not so much a melting pot as it is a salad. So a tossed salad, so that there are different. There's tomatoes, there's onions, there's lettuce, there's green peppers, there's cucumbers, there's squash, there's radishes, and all these different kinds of elements in this salad. Each one bringing its own particular flavor or its own particular quality to the salad, and together that makes this salad a very interesting dish. And this is multiculturalism, whereas the assimilation, the melting pot kind of blends everything together into some sort of mishmash that I guess is supposed to be homogenized or something. So you look here at some of the things that have occurred. Again, this is just another way of looking at these same ways of dealing with diversity in a society. Um, the genocide and population transfers being more to the extreme of inhumanity and rejection of the minority population, whereas on the right hand side, you see more of an acceptance and in fact a celebration of the differences within individual groups. And so this is a good graphic to tell you how different groups or different societies around the world may deal with intergroup relations. The experiences of many ethnic groups who make up the United States have been vastly different from group to group in many different ways. And so we're going to take a little bit about this, and first take a look at some of the ethnic backgrounds of Americans. So here you can see a graphic, and this is in your text if you want to study a little bit further, but what the percentages of individuals from various groups, and you can see by far the largest percentage and the highest number of immigrant groups has been from European descent, and then you see below that Americans of African, Asian, North Central and South American, Pacific Island descent. Latino populations that would include, as well as African American and Asian Americans, and Native Americans, which of course are not immigrants, but they're the native population here, represent about 1% of the overall population of the United States. The nation's founders were really made up only of individuals from England, and by and large, with some exceptions, but by and large, they were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant in origin. WASPs is the term that has been used for that group, but other white Europeans were considered to be inferior as they came over here. Each time a new group came in, they were marginalized by the larger society. So the Irish were rejected, the Italians were rejected, and the Southern Europeans, the Chinese, and other Asians, now the Latinos. While the immigration policies debate is very much alive in the current day and age. This is certainly not the first time in our history that this has been an issue for the American society to deal with. And if you study diversity and the experiences of the various groups that have come to the United States, you'll see that this is a pattern that has been oftentimes repeated. Latinos, though, today make up the largest racial and ethnic group in the United States, and something over 42 million and growing. Um, we tend to talk about Latinos as one ethnic group, and in fact, they vary very differently ethnically and socially, culturally, depending upon their country of origin. Mexicans and South Americans and individuals from Spain, for instance, are very, very different. Those from the Caribbean, there are many differences within those groups as well, and yet we tend to, the dominant group tends to lump them into one group, referring to them as Latinos. But it's an interesting fact that the United States is in fact the largest Spanish-speaking nation in the world, and yet there's a lot of focus upon learning English and adopting English as the official national language and all of that by individuals who've been here longer. Although they're a large group and although their language is very dominant in some parts of our country, they're still very underrepresented in political positions and governmental positions of power. And compared to white and Asian Americans, Latinos have less income, higher unemployment, and higher poverty rates. Here's a graphic that gives you a distribution of the dominant and minority groups in the United States, green being higher than average, purple being less than average, and the gold being sort of average, an average percentage of minority groups. Now, when we look at Alaska Natives, we certainly have a lot of individuals from other countries particularly around the Pacific Rim, here in Alaska, and yet I suspect that you'll see when they talk about minority groups here, they're talking about Native Alaskans, who of course were the original persons here. So once again, the notion of minority is really about the dominant political group. In the Constitution, the 3/5 compromise in that Constitution settled the questions of the balance of power between the northern and southern states, and there was a big battle over that as the Constitution was being formed. While the African Americans were not identified, were not recognized as having the rights of human beings because they were slaves, nonetheless the South got to count them as 3/5 of a person in determining their representation in the House of Representatives. But as you know, prior to the Civil War, Africans were held as slaves and treated as property. And since the Civil War as well, laws continued to restrict their movement. This is under Jim Crow, their ability to assemble at times, and certainly during slavery, what kind of religion they could have, what education they could receive. And in many respects, the vestiges of this continue to this day. Slave owners broke up slave families that really then prevented black males from getting too much power with their wives and their children, and the slave owners continued to be the most powerful person in their lives. And some say that the fact that as a group, African Americans tend to have more of a matriarchal kind of a system where grandmothers and mothers are more heads of households than the males. And again, I don't want to say this is a stereotype of the group, okay? But some individuals trace these patterns back to the Civil War and how the slave owners and the institutions of society broke up African American families and really disempowered the males and made them sort of irrelevant to much of the slave families. And so, again, when we think about things like affirmative action and those kinds of things in today's society, we have to look back to these kinds of features which underlie the reality today. And although these were things that might have happened 200, 300 years ago, they still have implications, and the effects continue to ripple in today's society. Segregation, of course, continued to be legal in the South really for well over 100 years after the end of the Civil War. And here are some of the legal steps that have been taken either against or on behalf of African Americans in particular in our society. The 1896 decision of the Supreme Court, Plessy versus Ferguson, institutionalized segregation. It said that segregation was okay as long as the facilities were equal. So that essentially made segregation legal in the United States. But in 1954, the Supreme Court overturned the Plessy ruling in the case of Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education, where it said separate by and of itself says it cannot be equal, separate cannot be equal, and mandated the racial integration of schools. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed by Congress that made discrimination based on race a federal crime, so that enables the federal government to step in cases of discrimination and sometimes try individuals who commit crimes against individuals of other races based upon on this act. Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Congress took down barriers for blacks having the right to vote in elections, although again they had to continue to struggle to actually get these things implemented in many areas. Did you know that until 1967, it was many states had laws against intermarriage of the races? The term that was used for the marriage between blacks and whites was miscegenation. And in 1967, I don't have the. I'm going to give you probably a little bit of inaccurate facts, but the gist is correct here. In Loving versus Virginia in 1967, Mr. and Mrs. Loving were I think Mr. Loving, I believe, was white and Mrs. Loving was black, if I remember correctly. Might have that backwards, but I don't think so. And they went to another state where there were no laws against interracial marriage, got married, moved back to their home in Virginia, and as I have read this story, literally they were woken up in the middle of the night and taken from their beds and put in jail because they were living in an interracial marriage in Virginia where such was against the law. In 1967, this decision, the Supreme Court ended all race-based restrictions on marriage in the United States. Look it up if you're interested in this, and you can get the more accurate story than what I'm giving you here. And then in 1968, a second Civil Rights Act was passed that extended protection to racial minorities in such areas as housing and those kinds of things. And so you can see that there's a history here over the course of 70 some odd years after the Civil War, really still 100 years and more after the Civil War ended, where civil rights have continued to be redefined for African Americans. Asian Americans are referred to oftentimes as a model minority, and there's a lot of controversy around that because Asian Americans are kind of held up by the majority population in the United States to the other minority groups and say, if the Asians can do this, so can you too. This shows you that America is really the land of equal opportunity. But if you look behind that image of the model minority, what you often find is, for instance, the income of an Asian American home may even the average income may even exceed the Caucasian income for the area. But you'll also find that there are 3 or 4 adults in that home, oftentimes, or 2 adults working 3 jobs each in order to bring home extra money. And that it isn't quite what it seems. The Asian Americans certainly experienced discrimination, and in the early 1900s they were outright excluded. Some Asians were excluded from immigration around the turn of the last century. Like Latinos, there's a great diversity among the subgroups of Asian Americans, and so again, to lump them into one group is really kind of ridiculous. The other thing that's important to note is that the experience of Asian Americans varies from generation to generation, and when they immigrated, I should say, the United States, whether it was done previously or today, whether this is a first or second generation Asian American, those kinds of things. These features also define very different experiences for individuals of this population in their immigration and integration into our society. Studies have shown that Asian Americans have to have a higher degree or work more in order to attain equal status in the workforce with Caucasians. And so while an Asian American may be in a higher position in corporate America, let's say, or an equal position in corporate America to many Caucasians, the odds are that Asian American has had to have higher degrees, more education to get to that position than the Caucasian had to have. So it isn't what it seems. Here's a graphic that talks a little bit about the countries of origin for Asian Americans and United States Latinos. Again, you can see there are many different groups and many different cultural traditions within those groups, and different immigration experiences within those groups as well. I would say particularly, well, for all of these groups, but for both of these groups. Our history of the treatment of Native Americans is, I think, fairly well known to most of us. The European cultures settled in the United States and essentially pushed Native Americans off of their land, formed treaties, and as one Native American student that I had in another class would say some years ago, that the United States government made all these treaties with the Native American nations in the United States and then proceeded never to keep any of the treaties. They broke every last one of them. And there were periods of genocide by the white population as well as population transfer. In fact, when the colonists first got here, there were attempts to enslave Native Americans, but they weren't successful at that, and that's when they turned to the African American slave trade. Our seventh president, Andrew Jackson, oversaw the forced relocation of several large tribes in the east and southern United States to reservations in the west in the 1830s, and this is the famous Trail of Tears. And Jackson even said later in his retirement that he regretted having participated in this, but really, this was the expulsion of entire groups because the European immigrants, settlers, wanted the lands and the resources that the Native Americans occupied, and so used the United States government to get them off of that land. By the end of the 1800s, most of the Native Americans in the lower 48 were forced to live on reservations, and the number of Native Americans in North America was about 250,000 compared to the estimated 15 million at first contact when the Europeans first arrived in the late 1400s. Think about that. 250,000 compared to 15 million 400 or 500 years later, or 400 or 500 years before. And some writers estimate as much as 45 million, not just 15 million. This tells you a little bit about the rate of genocide that occurred as European Americans settled this continent. And yet, again, this is not something we read about much in our history books, and this is genocide that is far worse in numbers than the Holocaust, which of course we study about because it occurred in another culture. The Native Americans are often referred to as the invisible minority, I should say. Many Americans are barely aware of Native American presence in the United States outside the 3 states where about a third of them live here. In fact, Native Americans, the individuals who were here first, did not all have citizenship in the United States and the right to vote until 1924, less than 100 years ago. And still about half of this population remain isolated on reservations today. And this population has the highest rates of alcoholism and suicide of any racial or ethnic group. This would include Native Alaskan population, by the way. Lower life expectancy, education lags behind, dropout rates are higher, and here on housing and reservations, about almost half of the population live in inadequate housing. For over the years, many Native Americans have denied their own ethnic heritage, and this is something that has begun to turn a corner and some changes occurring. And there is some talk about the increase in Native American population in the United States, and I don't know that it is so much, I've been told at least, that it isn't so much that the Native American population is increasing as it is that individuals are finally acknowledging in census counts and things like this and taking some pride in their own heritage. And this is, again, another kind of thing. If you have a diversity class sometime, we have more time to talk about this. There's a lot of things that the dominant culture have done to discourage Native Americans from identifying themselves with their own ethnic backgrounds. Here's a chart from the text that looks at race, ethnicity, and education, and how the different groups fare at different levels of education. And of course, again, you can see the Caucasians, the whites by far, fare the best, and Asian Americans, as you get into areas of really higher degrees, the percentage-wise, they seem to do better in college. But again, this has a lot to do with the fact that there's a lot of value in education among Asians, and also because of the fact that in order to get along in a society, they have to be educated better. A little bit about the shifting mix of race and ethnicity in the United States. There is much being said about the fact that white America is becoming less and less white and becoming more Latino. And in fact, what the concern is that it's the European Americans that are concerned about losing their majority status, and so that by 2050, the European Americans, and this is one of the mistakes that a lot of people make about this, that they say we're going to be a minority. Well, we won't be a minority for a number of different reasons. If you want to look at it numerically speaking, in 2050, there's still half of the individuals, or just under half of the individuals, are still going to be of European descent. But beyond that, who is occupying the seats of power in our culture? And look at that in 2050 and see who the minority is. And unless things continue to change, and change pretty seriously, white Europeans are going to continue to dominate the institutions in the society. But I'm just saying that because I think that a lot of this emphasis upon, speak English if you come to America and everything, it all reflects this kind of fear, and it's an irrational fear, about the composition of America changing. This is sort of that salad bowl concept, that it's going to become a very rich culture if we can learn to look past our racial and ethnic differences. So the waves of immigrants that came to the United States in the 1800s and early 1900s, my grandparents being among them. And today, more immigrants live in the United States than at any other time in this nation's history. And in fact, in California, racial ethnic minorities have become the majority in that state, and particularly in the south of the state. In many states, in the south, you find English and Spanish being spoken at, in announcements in airports and in large buildings and things like this. And most of our recent immigrants have been from Latin America and other places of the world, that is really changing the racial and ethnic mix of the United States. And this concern that there are too many immigrants kind of reflects this desire of the European majority to maintain that majority status and control in this culture. And I think it's certainly an irrational fear and an invalid concern. But that will conclude the second section for this week's lecture on race and ethnicity. I hope that you glean some information from these two talks that is thought-provoking for you and useful, and maybe even kind of reshape a little bit of the thinking that you have about topics such as equality and civil rights, also immigration and those kinds of things. These are very very lively topics in our society today, and having good information can help you make good decisions and lead you to talk to your congressmen and senators about making the right choices as laws are crafted and passed in our society. Thank you very much, and I'll talk with you again next week.